Good morning, folks. What a delightful community of practice this is. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to read off here a fair amount. I hope that's all right, because I'm not a preacher by training. I am a teacher, though, and I guess this is a teaching, so we're in good spot. It's an honor and a joy, privilege to be with you today, particularly during Pride Month. I'm really excited for that opportunity. My understanding was Chesson Buttigieg was here earlier, which is a pretty tough act to follow. He didn't get him. Oh, I'm sorry. There were talks. I apologize if I've given something away. He was at least considering it, which I think is a real mark in your favor. My name is Joseph Kuilema. I teach in the social work program at Grand Valley State University. As I mentioned, I taught at Calvin University for 14 years, and I've been at Grand Valley for 2. My standard public speaking engagement runs 50 minutes to 3 hours. So I'm going to try to avoid that, and I'm going to try to avoid lecturing at you. That's, I think, one of the problems with spiritual communities these days to begin with. I will say that one of the frequent pieces of feedback that I get from students who have me as a professor is that I make them upset about the world. They also say that I inspire them to do something about that. I'm going to try to be a little more inspiration and a little less upset. But I do believe personally, and I imagine many of you do as well, that to talk about love without talking about hurt and harm is disingenuous, right? It's not real. So we have to talk about some things that upset us, and certainly some things that upset me. I don't think I'm going to say a lot of new things to you today. Probably nothing new. Certainly in the pre-talk, the questions that I'm wrestling with are the questions that you're wrestling with, that I think a lot of people are wrestling with to different degrees of honesty. I believe, and I was raised in a tradition that professes that God is love, and if that tradition had stopped there, it probably would have done a pretty good job. I think I could stop there, and this would be a pretty good teaching. But I'm going to keep going. I still believe that, even though I've been on something of a journey of deconstruction, and I think many of you have also been on journeys of deconstruction and reconstruction and faith and doubt, which is to say the spiritual journey, right? Part of my own journey of deconstruction has been realization, one that probably took me too long as somebody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person to realize, that the community that was teaching me that God is love and that we ought to love our neighbor was also practicing exclusion, and that they were doing that overtly and unapologetically in many ways. I'm still coming to terms with that. I suspect I always will be. I suspect some of you are trying to come in terms with what it meant to have been raised in a community that told you that God is love and that you ought to love your neighbor and that you didn't see it. I'm also coming very specifically from the Christian Reformed Church. I'm in West Michigan, so I'm going to assume a degree of familiarity about that, which is in itself exclusionary in some ways. So if you know nothing about the CRC, first of all, good. That's probably a healthy mental space to be in. You might just want to consider staying that way. I'm going to give you what I think you need to know as part of my own story about that. And I know that some of you began your faith journeys in the CRC too. That tradition, on its best days, did lean heavily into loving God with the mind. As an intellectual, it would think of itself as a philosophical tradition. One of the dangers that I don't think they saw creeping in with that, and that I didn't see, was that love itself became an idea a philosophical, theological idea, not something that you actually do to people, that you love people. It became more abstract than I think it ought to be. Because I believe that to love isn't about understanding love perfectly or academically or philosophically or even theologically. It's loving. Love the action, not the idea. Love, as Baldwin says in the quote that I put in here, love as a movement in the world, right? I was going to have that quote played, but there were some tech difficulties with that, which is great because it gives you some homework. So after this, if you like anything that I said, I would encourage you to Google "Love Has Never Been a Popular Movement," James Baldwin, and watch the clip. It's about a minute long. I'll read it, and you can read it. I am not James Baldwin on multiple levels, and it really does come across better when he says it. But as he says, love has never been a popular movement, and few people actually want to be free. That's the first challenge here, to be one of the few people who choose to want to be free, to be one of the few people who try to love the world and with our passion make it a slightly better place. I'm a social worker. I know there are at least a few social workers in the audience, met a few again in the pre-talk. So I hope that's not heard as a call to self-sacrifice and burnout, because I think the Christian tradition has sort of double doses of that sometimes too. And your calling to love the world can sometimes be an oppressive, guilty thing. I don't think that's right. Some people try to hold too much together. Sometimes self-sacrifice can obliterate the self, right? It's a call to love, but that includes loving yourself. Lesson I'm also trying to learn. So for me, the call to love as a movement involved saying no to the CRC, leaving the tradition, getting kicked out, semantics, one way or the other. I mean, I left the tradition. I was fired from its institutions. So here, if you're familiar with the Christian Bible, with the New Testament, there's this little spot where Paul, reflecting on his former identity as Saul, says, "Look, I'm the first one who should get this stuff, from the tribe of blah, 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 a Pharisee by training." So this is my version of that, right? I was born and raised in the Christian Reformed Church. I went to Christian schools. I went to Calvin College. My parents met at Calvin College. All my siblings went there. My older sister and I both married Calvin grads. I was an elder in the Christian Reformed Church. I was a professor at Calvin College. This was my tradition. Beyond that, as the name implied, I am Dutch. So there's the ethnic thing. I'm actually Fries. If that means anything to you, then you're too deep. You're too deep. Specific tribes within tribes. My great-grandfather ran a Dutch language newspaper in Kalamazoo. My great-great-grandfather, here's the biggest brag of the night, or the morning, was a personal secretary to Abraham Kuyper. I have personal correspondence between him and Kuyper about the emergence of the Dutch Reformed churches in West Michigan. So it was my tradition. I was in there. These were my people. And in many ways, they still are. And in many ways, they always will be. And it would have been easy to stay. It would have been easy to stay. But I was kicked out in 2022. In 2021, a former student of mine asked me to officiate his wedding. Cole was still in the process of coming out as trans, which is a journey in and of itself. Cole was out to me as trans and out to some close family. So, if you read media accounts of this, they'll say that it was a same-sex wedding, and it wasn't. We'll call it a queer wedding. It was a beautiful wedding. And Cole and Annika, his wife, are a beautiful couple. Cole was at my house literally yesterday, preparing to head down to Pride. Grand Rapids had Pride yesterday. In Grand Rapids with my wife, Jocelyn, who's a nurse practitioner at Catherine's Health Center, which is a federally qualified low-income health center in Grand Rapids, and one of the few places, far too few, in West Michigan where you can get gender-affirming care if you have little insurance or no insurance, if you have documents or no documents, if you were raised here or if you came here as a refugee from Sudan or from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And while we think of this often in terms of West Michigan, she just had a trans Sudanese refugee client this last week, right? That's not a HIPAA violation. I don't know anything else about that person. You know, Cole's an amazing human. The fact that some people believe that his marriage is a sham or an affront to God or a threat to Western civilization, right, is in some ways, to me, incomprehensible. And I think there are also people in this audience struggling to comprehend some things that people seem to believe. The short end of the story is that someone whose identity I may never know saw photos of that wedding and forwarded them to the provost at Calvin. And I got called in, and they said, "Is this you in the photos?" And I was like, "What, am I going to deny that it's me in the photo? Am I going to assert that this was photoshopped or something?" Yeah, that's me. I did that. I didn't rub it in their faces. You know, I hadn't tried to make this a part of my, a wedding is a sacred thing. I told Cole and Annika, yes, I'm an advocate, I'm a social justice type person, but I'm not going to weaponize your marriage in this fight. And we had some really good talks about that in advance of it, because I think we all knew what might happen, but I told them, you know, share whatever photos you want. It's your wedding. It's your wedding. You can't, if I'm going to officiate it, you can't hide that because you're afraid of what might happen to me. I accept that it might happen, and it did. It didn't have to, but it did. So 14 years of teaching came to an end. It didn't matter that it was a non-religious wedding. Cole's an atheist. It didn't matter that the CRC actually hadn't yet declared these confessional issues. None of that mattered. I made lots of arguments. But let me go back a moment. I said I couldn't comprehend a belief system that rejects Cole and Annika's love. That's probably not true. Because as I said, those were my people. And if I'm really honest, and this is the second sort of challenge in the Baldwin quote, it could have been me. I could have been that person, choosing to exclude them. If you read that quote straight through, it seems like he's headed in very different directions. And even if you watch him, it's clear that he is, that he's wrestling with this as he's talking. And he moves from saying, love has never been popular, you have to choose love, to saying, anytime you walk down the street, you're tempted to despair. And then, hard pivot, you have to remember that you could be that person. You could be that monster. You could be that cop. Which again, for James Baldwin, writing in the 60s, is, his friends were gunned down. Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King Jr. The cops were, maybe still are, an overtly white supremacist entity. It's a statement. It's a statement. I respect it a lot. I'm not sure I can live up to it. So it's a challenging pivot there to think. But I do think he's right. And maybe that's some of my own Christian tradition coming in there. But I do think it's important to remember, for me, and I think it's one of the values of this community, a common humanity. That even these people who we struggle to understand, who treat us badly, are human beings. They are us. What you are looking at is you. So what do we do with that, right? And my life could have gone differently. I had some relationships that brought me into close contact with LGBTQ people very young, when I was, 16, 17, all the way through my life. One of my groomsmen, grad school roommate, gay man, wonderful friend. If I hadn't had those relationships, how might my thinking have evolved? I don't know. Certainly everything in my socialization was pointing me in one direction. And somehow that didn't become the case. I should also say that I'm proud of the decision that I made to officiate that wedding in 2021, but I also decided to work at Calvin in 2008. I decided to take a job there. I like to tell myself, and I think it's true, that in 2008 that institution could have gone a different direction, and that there was some pathways forking ahead of it. And it could be sort of religious guilt or religious trauma, but I can't always help but think historically, would you celebrate the faculty member who chose to work at an all-white segregated university in the South in 1952 just because they thought it might head one way? I don't know. I don't know that I'm actually the hero here, right? I think there's sort of a bare minimum here, and I think that's been an important thing for me to reckon with too. I teach human rights now at Grand Valley, which has been a ton of fun. I had Matt Laidlaw in I think he's been here, yeah? I had him as a student. It was in an online class, so I never really got to talk with him, but I sensed a kindred spirit. In human rights class, which is all about inherent dignity and worth, right? The inherent dignity and worth of the person, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done. It's a really challenging idea. I think my students may get annoyed at me at how much time I spend on that on the first day of class. Do you really? And it's part of the code of ethics for social workers too, the inherent dignity and worth of all people. Do we believe it's impossible in some ways to hold that consistently, or it's very difficult for me, but we're going to try. So last point here, I grew up in the CRC. There's 3. Baldwin says, you could be that person, you could be that monster, you could be that cop. You have to decide in yourself not to be. The active practice of love and justice, right? Which I think a lot about. I think many of you have probably heard Cornel West say that justice is what love looks like in public, right? But the opposite is also true, that loving somebody is treating them justly, right? If you take it the other way. To love someone, as Dr. King said, is not necessarily to like them. He's got some sermons where he says, I find it difficult to like the people who are trying to blow up my house. And yet I am called to love them. So to love is not to like. It's not that. But it is at a minimum to do right by them, to act justly towards them, to try to respect and lift up their inherent dignity and worth, and to remember that their flourishing is in some way caught up with your flourishing, that we are all, as King said, caught up in a garment together. So in the context of Christianity and LGBTQ people, love can't just be a set of beliefs. Can't be straight folks like myself cognitively saying, I'm an affirming person, end of story, right? You have to act. You have to act. That's, I think, the essence of that text from the author of 1 John. Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. You gotta actually love people. So when somebody asks you to officiate their wedding, you do it. If I had said, listen, Cole, I believe in my heart that you should be able to get married. I believe that God smiles on your marriage. But I'm not currently in a position to. That's not love. It's not love. It's not love. It would have been understandable. I think Cole himself would have forgiven me for that. I think that's how much he respects me, which is a shocking thing in some regards. He would have been disappointed, but I think he would have understood it. Going into the fall of 2021, when this wedding happened, my wife and I had premature identical twins in the summer. And they'd been in the hospital on the NICU for about a month. Nothing terribly serious, but, am I going to die on this hill right here? Am I going to lose health insurance and benefits and money? I was exhausted the whole time. There's nothing quite as disorienting as being in meetings with very serious people talking about how they're going to fire you and be like, just do it then. Like, guys, I'm so tired right now. I do not care. You can send it to that committee. Here's my appeal. I don't care. I'm very tired. I've been giving bottles all night. Okay. It was a wild ride. Boy, I should have done. I'm still okay on time? All right. My experience has been that real love, active love, though, does come with a cost, right? And that it should. I think love is costly. That's certainly what the Christian Bible seems to suggest everywhere. All the verses, the life of Jesus Christ, is, if you understand that way, certainly love is costly. With apologies to Mars Hill, I know Kent was here for a while. Love does not always win right now, right? That's to use a fancy word, that's an eschatological statement. My experience has been that love loses a fair amount. Love costs, love hurts. About a year, almost exactly a year and a couple weeks after I officiated that wedding, a trans student at Redeemer killed themselves. I'm assuming too much. So Redeemer is a CRC institution in Canada, right? And that was a reminder for me of the cost of not doing it, right? So the cost of love, I lost my job. I got another one. The cost of not loving is death, suicide, self-harm. Beckett Noble had been an advocate for queer kids on Redeemer's campus for their entire time at Redeemer. And they wrote directly in an open letter to administrators, suicide note, I never thought it would be me who was finally the first to collapse under the weight of everything we go through to try to get a Christian education while embracing who God created us to be. Terrible. Just terrible. Love has never been a popular movement. As I'm closing here, it's also just a strange week for me. I'm a little emotional because the governing body of my old denomination, Synod, just met. And, during Pride Month, full steam ahead. Their crowning achievement this year was a decision to immediately suspend elders, deacons, pastors, anyone judged to be affirming, effective at the end of their meeting. They did that with people in the room who were affirming, people who were coming up to the mic and saying, if you choose to do this, I'm out, you know that. And they said, yeah. One of the delegates compared it to a test from God, Abraham and Isaac, effectively positioning affirming Christians as Isaac, that we need to be willing to sacrifice these people because God demands it. That's a scary idea about God. It's just frightening. And my church, I attend Sherman Street Christian Reformed Church, although I have not been a member since I got fired, because I just didn't want to put money into that. We're going to get kicked out, which is fine. But it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy, and one that I think you're pretty familiar with over here in Ottawa County. Side note, I was actually here yesterday on the Grand Fondo, a bike ride, all the way out to the lake and back. And it's a wild ride in terms of yard signs. As you come up out of Grand Rapids, get into the farmland, little Heart OI, It's a wild ride. Yeah. So, I know many of you have faced the pain of being pushed out of a religious tradition, whether overtly or in subtle ways, to the faith communities you were born into and that nurtured you. My denomination made promises to me at my infant baptism that they have not kept. I've been struggling with anger, something we also talked about in the pre-talk. Maybe that's a toxic masculinity thing. Everyone handles grief differently. Not all that anger is righteous or productive. I've had difficulty remembering, especially this week, that some of those guys from Minnesota and the Dakotas are people of inherent dignity and worth. So on my better days, I remember the words of folks like Baldwin: you could be that person. You could be that monster, and you have to decide, and it is a decision, and one that needs to be made, I think, daily, not to be. So the world is held together, really is held together by the love and passion of a very few people. Let's choose love, even when it's not a popular movement.